Could we be witnessing the end of the Big 12 conference and the beginning of a brand new super conference? Johnny Talk Sports to bring you my analysis and reaction to the news that is going around, that has been going around for about the last 30 to 45 minutes. And that is Oklahoma and Texas have both reached out to the SEC conference about potentially joining the SEC. And the reason why I asked if this was the end of the Big 12 conference, could we be witnessing the end of the Big 12 conference, is because Oklahoma and Texas, they pretty much make up the Big 12. They're the two main teams in the Big 12 conference. I mean, we have seen teams in the Big 12 have outlier seasons recently. Just last season, we had Iowa State have an outlier season. Best season in program history last year for the Cyclones. 2019, Baylor had a phenomenal season. But other than that, Oklahoma, until somebody knocks them down in the Big 12, they're going to remain the kings of the Big 12 conference. Now, I had to think about this for a moment. Is joining the SEC conference even a smart move for Oklahoma? Because if you look at Oklahoma's track record against the SEC conference, it isn't good at all. Every single time they have played an SEC opponent in the college football playoff, they have lost. They've lost to the powerhouses of the SEC. They have lost to Alabama. They've lost to Georgia. They have lost to LSU in 2019. The outlier season for LSU is what it's starting to look like at this point based off what we saw last season. But they always find themselves on the losing end to the powerhouses of the SEC conference. But whenever they play an SEC team in either a regular season game or in one of the bowl games that really doesn't matter as much, like, for example, like still a New Year's Six game, they still are winning those games. I mean, they dominated Florida in the New Year's Six this past season. I mean, but Florida wasn't playing a bunch of their star players. They beat Auburn in the New Year's Six a few years ago. They actually, now that I think of it, they got blown out by Texas A&M in A&M's first season in the SEC conference. So when we look at the track record for the Sooners against SEC opponents, not a good track record at all. I mean, they have wins against the SEC conference, but no wins that are like absolutely meaningful. Like, they have yet to beat an SEC team in the playoff. In fact, they've yet to win a single game in the college football playoff. And for Texas, they haven't been as relevant since about 2010, maybe 2011, whenever it was they were last in the national championship. But Texas, they don't have the best track record against SEC teams either. I mean, they haven't played as much SEC teams as Oklahoma has. They do have a win against Georgia in a New Year's Six game, but it's the same situation as Oklahoma against Florida last year. I mean, Georgia, they didn't play with a bunch of their star players. I mean, you can't take away what they did in those games, but in my mind, if you're not playing in the college football playoff, does your bowl game really mean anything? And we saw Texas in 2019, they held their own against LSU, but after seeing how LSU did after that season, it was pretty clear that nobody was going to beat that team, as LSU had one of the best offenses in college football history. And we're going to see Texas play Arkansas in week 2, an SEC team. So we'll see how Texas does against the Razorbacks. But the main thing I want to discuss here is what would the conferences, what the divisions within the SEC conference, what would it look like? Would they bring in 16 teams? Would it be not? Well, would it be a 16-team conference, or would they stick with 14 and kick 2 of them out? Maybe. How would that work? Because when you're having a conference of at least 16 teams, that's becoming a super conference, which is why I bring up the idea of the super conference. At least we're going to still see the Red River Showdown every single season. I mean, we could possibly get the renewal of the rivalry between Texas and Texas A&M. That's another bright point to these two teams joining this conference. And of course, there's always the money that gets involved with it. I mean, we've seen Nebraska leave the Big 12 for the Big 10, basically for money reasons, which is a huge benefit. We've seen Texas A&M and Missouri leave the Big 12 conference to join the SEC conference. And of course, a better value came out of that. There's been a lot of teams that have been leaving the Big 12 throughout the last maybe 15 years, at least. Last 10, 15 years. And with Oklahoma and Texas leaving the Big 12 and joining the SEC conference, in my mind, the Big 12 conference is going to be dead at that point, because who won the Big 12 conference? Who would be that team in the Big 12 that would ultimately stick out? If they stick with the teams they have, because you're going to pretty much only have, if nothing changes, you're just going to have 8 teams sitting in the Big 12. Does that mean that the other 8 teams are going to have to find another conference, or are they going to possibly, will the SEC kick out some of the worst teams and keep it at 14? Are they going to kick out Vanderbilt? Are they going to kick out Missouri? Or could we see Nebraska come back to the Big 12? Because Nebraska, they've had some beef with the Big 10 conference just in this last year alone. Could we see Iowa go to the Big 12? The possibilities would be endless, but I would lean it towards the Big 12 being dead at that point if we see Oklahoma and Texas leave, because they are the 2 biggest markets in the Big 12. They're the 2 most notable teams in that conference. And maybe this news story, potentially rumor at this point, because the SEC commissioner came out and said that they're only focused on the 2021 season, maybe this inspires the idea that we need a conference realignment. But that's all I have. Comment your thoughts down below, like, share, and subscribe, and I will talk to you next time.